Hey, what's up, folks? How you doing? Welcome to another session of Cafeteria Science. First things first, I would just like to say I've been quiet lately. You haven't seen any content whatsoever coming from me in the past 2 months, and this is sad because I was doing a series called "Picking the Bible Apart in Tweezers." For some weird reason, I opted not to continue the series, but to actually continue it as articles on my Substack. So you can still find the series on my Substack, but it won't be airing on my channel because I felt I had dived too deep into religious water. So I wanted to draw back a bit and not lose the very concept of the channel, which is to merely propagate the love for science and philosophy in our country. So in that vein, I'm talking to somebody you are really familiar with, and I won't go into so much loaded introductions, but I'd just like to start on a lighter note. What have you been up to, and what's keeping you busy lately?
Hey, thanks for having me again. It's been in the making for quite some time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been writing. Yeah, my last book was when 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So I've been trying to get out two books. Basically, there's one, a work of fiction, and another one is just basically my musings on the things that trouble my mind. And the working title is the ramblings, Keith's ramblings on legitimacy. So it's like just getting the mind to ramble around that.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
and I've been reading your Substack, really good. Yeah, I like the Bible series. But yeah, maybe you should just bring it to a conclusion.
true.
Just have one more.
Because at the end of the day, sometimes it looks as though you have your head too wrapped in the weeds,
Yeah.
and then people start to lose the point of what you're doing exactly.
But also, it's very difficult to have an objective conversation
Yeah,
about the Bible. And I know on one episode I'm supposed to appear, but yeah,
Yeah, I was supposed to talk about.
people catch feelings.
So, of course, you two have been on Substack. You are on Substack, but I've noticed you've been a bit. You haven't been putting out articles as much as I have been. So, what's been taking much of your time, and what's
So initially,
going
my blog for years actually was on Google Blogspot.
Okay.
But then with these new blogging platforms coming up, the traffic on Google Blogspot has reduced. You're the one who introduced me to Substack. I think I've put out one or two articles, but basically I've just decided to concentrate on my books, writing. And every once in a while, maybe I'll pitch in with a post or two, but yeah, mostly just been writing.
Okay. That's interesting, yeah. And I know writing takes a lot of effort. It's something that you have to be deliberate about. So,
And you see the way, sorry to cut you, but the way I write, I'm a very impulsive writer.
yeah, true.
So there are times when I would write for days and days on end, sometimes I don't even sleep. But then there are times when I just can't bring myself to to even do a full stop. I can't even write. Yeah. So, but then you're right about you being deliberate and dedicating, but also when your energies are spread around too much,
Yeah.
it can reduce your efficiency. So that's the reason why I've not been blogging as much.
Yeah, true. So, the point of our conversation today is I wanted us to just deep dive into your new book, as you have called it, your musings, the inspiration behind it before we get into the core ideas that you're trying to put out there. So, what exactly are you trying to get out with this book that you are currently working on? Yeah, I think that's the first question I would like to get into.
Yeah, so it's really an existential journey, if you ask me, because I ask questions that probably we just take for granted. We don't ask enough questions like, okay, what makes us, be a part of the country? Like, what is it at a primordial level that makes us obey? One, what gives authority to those that we give authority to? Like, why, for example, you subordinate yourself to someone simply because of a structure that has been put there? And I got to this point. Well, I've read a lot around nation building and statehood. I've read Thomas Hobbes. I've read Aristotle and so on. But recently, there's a very celebrated lawyer in the UK His name is Jonathan Sampson, Lord Sampson, yeah. So he wrote a series of essays on how the law was interacting with troubled times. I think it was in the wake of Brexit. Anyway, he makes a statement, and those essays were the subject of his lectures, so-called Wreath lectures. They're done by the BBC every year. I digress. He made a statement to say, what gives a country power over its citizens through its elected officials is something called legitimacy. And he says legitimacy is something that is below law, but is above tradition. But then it is what allows us to relegate our collective decision making to a body, for example, of elected officials. Because then we believe that they, and this is at a very tacit level, that they have our best interests at heart, and that they are not prone to their own individual interests or sectarian interests. Yeah. So I found that a very interesting idea, and I'm trying to explore that further because I don't really agree with it. Yeah. And I know when you were critiquing my first chapter, you said I'm negatively disposed towards it. Not really that, but yeah. I'd love to just explore that. Okay. The second thing is I thought of the family setup. Yeah. Okay. The issue of who's a legitimate and an illegitimate child. Okay. There are a lot of so-called illegitimate children. Yeah. But the badge of legitimacy or illegitimacy seems to be whether you're born within or out of wedlock. Yeah. So if you're out of wedlock, then you're illegitimate. If you're within wedlock, you're legitimate. And I look at some of the most famous so-called illegitimate children, people like Leonardo da Vinci, and so on. So really, that was the inspiration behind this series of essays, yeah, which is morphing into this book.
I think there's a lot to pick from there, but to make it more fluid to the everyday listener and somebody just delving into these conversations for the first time, I feel like how about if you re-emphasize the definition of legitimacy and that point you have brought out, what is it that primarily compels people to obey? And I also want you to factor in how maybe trust in credentialism of sorts, mm-hmm, or like trust in a shared trustworthiness that has been built through experience. Mm-hmm. How do these factors maybe influence people to ascribe power and trust to these people in higher authorities? Does that boil into anything to do with legitimacy and stuff like that? So as you define it, I would, mm-hmm, like you to factor in those points.
Okay, thank you. That's a loaded question. Yeah. So if you go by the book definition of legitimacy is basically defined as having the legal right to do something. Mm. Okay? So the difference, for example, you could be more intelligent than a lawyer. Yes. Okay? But you're not allowed audience, okay, before a high court judge or a Supreme Court judge because you're not a lawyer. Okay? But the lawyer, one who's been called to the bar, who's passed the bar exam, has been closed with that legitimacy, okay, because they have the legal right to do that. So legitimacy is basically the book definition is the legal right. Now the interesting thing is the legal right itself is derived from years and years and years and years, or sometimes not even years, but it's derived from a build-up of societal norms and practices. Yeah. That then says, okay, this group of people is allowed to do this, and this one is not allowed to do this, and so on and so forth. Yeah. That in itself does not take away from your ability to exercise authority in a certain role, or to think like someone in a certain role, or to influence activities in a certain role. Yeah. Let me break it down with an example. Yeah. If you're going to be president, there's a structure, okay? Yeah. That is put up. Yeah. That is a legal structure. Okay, you get elected, you get sworn in. There's a lot of ceremony. Actually, similar to marriage. If you're going to marry in a civil way, there's a lot of ceremony and so forth, and you sign and so on. and you're recognized as a president. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay? However, that does not necessarily mean that you are the one who's going to be making the decisions, you're the one who's going to be ruling.
Yeah.
So there's a legitimate structure that is recognized. But in terms of giving effect to that structure, there are all these things that can happen. We've had people like Vladimir Putin, for example.
Yeah.
The Russian law said you cannot serve, I think, beyond 3 consecutive terms. There must be a break. So he decided to forward, when his third term elapsed, they put in a guy called Medvedev, okay, to be a figurehead as president. But everyone knew that guy was just a figurehead. So legitimately he was president, but the person who was making decisions is another one. And then, so then the question there that you ask yourself is, who's actually the president? Is it the legitimate president or the one who's actually president who's taking the decisions? So those are the nuances around legitimacy and its definition.
So I'm wary of those facts, and I remember when you shared the excerpt for your book, you had also talked about how maybe something that legitimacy might be mounted in is not something material or factual in any sense, but it's simply abstract ideas that are almost like society agreed upon values that are not necessarily tangible values. So say, for example, you had also brought out the fact that because there's nothing rigid and material that we mount the legitimacy into, it's fluid in a sense.
Yes, it's fluid in a sense, but
So
over time,
how do also social constructs boil into now backing up the legitimacy? That's
so you see, social constructs have been, and I think the most important innovation that our race has come up with is the ability to create something from without, the social construct. The idea of a country in itself is a social construct. A company is a social construct. The whole judiciary system, the presidency, not the president, the presidency is a social construct. But we've been able as a race to develop that. And when we ascribe the respect and the decorum to it, it allows for the protection of whatever rights want protected, and then the furtherance of our race. So, it may not be tangible what you mount it on, but it's as important, maybe even more important than what is tangible. And the way society has developed is that over time, the law follows legitimacy. Yeah. So once you have a social construct, and once you have a legitimately recognized position, you legislate for it. Okay. A good example is I saw yesterday. I read a long article by Dr. Shua on homosexuality. Okay, and he talked about how it is wrong to discriminate, against people who are differently sexually oriented and so on and so forth. Now, that is basically just the first step, right? Where society recognizes a certain ill. Okay. The next thing now is to make it a legitimate part of conversation. And once that happens, then you can legislate for it. And there'll be a law now that protects all these.
So basically, legitimacy isn't something that supersedes the base human intuitions.
No.
So at some point, if we say it's society, how can I put it? At some point, if we say it's culture, let me give an example of racism in the old American state.
Yes.
It was almost socially acceptable, like it's a norm to own black slaves.
Yes, it was.
So the practice of owning black slaves was legitimate in a sense, because at the time it wasn't something that the society looked upon as a wrong thing. Exactly. But at the core of it, the practice itself, we could say, is somewhat intrinsically wrong to own human slaves.
Yes.
So legitimacy, I would say, perhaps. Do you also factor in the fact that it's limited in a sense that it could lead people in all the wrong places?
Yeah, because legitimacy has a lot to do with the acceptability.
Yeah.
Okay? And when something is largely accepted, okay, it's very easy for you to legislate for it. And you pass. Because the way we make laws, like currently, you have to go through Parliament. The Parliament itself is a representative, or ideally anyway, of the interests of everyone. When you see Parliament, you're supposed to see yourself. Okay, the poorest of us should be in Parliament, and the richest of us should be in Parliament. So at the end of the day, you have a simmering into one of all these ideas. So the example I give of racism or the practice of owning slaves is a very good one. Another good example is gambling. There's a book, and I'll give it to you, by Mario Puzo. It's called The Last Dawn. Now, The Last Dawn talks about a mafia, an Italian mafia, who, of course, has seen better days and is close to dying. And he says he needs to ensure that his children and his children's children are taken care of, okay, through his illegal business. But the only way that can happen is if the illegal business is made legal.
Okay.
So he spends millions and millions of dollars lobbying the state legislature of Nevada, Las Vegas, Nevada, to get gambling to be legitimized. Okay? And it's almost prophetic. Eh? Today, if you walk around, I know you're not a big sports fan, but gambling currently is intrinsically tied to sports. And there's millions and millions and millions of dollars that moves. There are people who go to games not because they want to watch the game, but because they've placed a bet.
Yeah.
What has happened? From 1990, when Mario Puzo wrote that book, to now, gambling has been legitimized. In addition to that, now, it has been legislated for. It's now legal.
Yeah.
Does that change the nature of gambling? No. Does it change the fact that people get addicted and they find themselves in debt and so forth? No. The only difference is that because of the way to legitimize it, okay, it's now been legislated for, and it's legal. So, the point being, the way society has been developing, okay, once and the development of the law is, and it's a very dangerous thing, because then it means the way owning slaves was legitimate then, okay. Even now, depending on who's pushing the agenda, it's very easy for you to legitimize, some social ills, simply because either you have the arrogance of the numbers, or you have the general public conscience on your side, or any of those things. Now, it's not far-fetched to think that 20, 10 years from now, 30, 50 years, someone come back and say, oh, wait a minute. What have we done with this gambling thing? And by the way, I'm just using it as an example. I don't gamble myself, but I'm just using it as an example. What have we done with this gambling thing? It's giving us more harm than good. Another movement will start, and then it will be outlawed and so on. Yeah. And you can go all over. You can talk about prostitution. You can talk about different things.
Yeah. So I remember at the start of our conversation, you said what the primary, what lies at the core of the book is trying to get to understand why people obey and why they do what they do. But I feel like, don't you think it would be also equally prudent to try to get to the core of what maybe, say for example, a truth would be, a truth that supersedes what we just deem as legitimate, or say, for example, a form of reality that supersedes like human intuitions. I'll give you an example of how some people would argue for what is morally upright by saying morality can simply, a right action can simply be brought down to what transcends just human rights and stuff like that. So, say for example, me cutting your hand is something that is experientially bad for you. It's not about what is socially agreed upon. I'm sure that's or yes, of course. I'm not gonna do it. It's not based on what is socially agreed upon. It's not based on anything. But the fact that you can consciously and experientially feel the pain of the undesirable act of cutting out your hand, then we could maybe arrive to like a moral truth. Like, say, for example, you're not supposed to do that. But people, again, argue that you can't simply get an ought from an ease. What these actions are basically showing you are like maybe just brute facts. Cutting a hand hurts. Punching somebody in the face hurts, but that doesn't necessarily translate into do's and don'ts. You know what I mean? So now my question is, are you also going to argue for a truth that supersedes legitimacy? Like, where are you taking the argument for legitimacy, or how are you going to show that it crumbles at some point?
Well, it's an interesting viewpoint.
Yeah.
The point I'm trying to make is that there are two issues that you can argue for.
Yeah.
When you look at human history, you can understand why these social structures were created.
Yeah.
And why they need to be clothed in legitimacy. Because it's for the protection and the furtherance of our species, by and large.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to show that that does not mean that this is above, legitimacy is above narrow sectarian interests.
Yeah.
Far from it. Okay? Far from it. What it does is that it muddles the waters. Because on one hand, okay, you may not know that in pursuing what is legitimate, for example, okay, basically maybe you're just advancing the agenda of a few sectarian interests. Let me give you a good example. People talk about the rule of law.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, no, we respect the rule of law. Okay?
Yeah.
But the rule of law itself is a fallacy. It's neither here nor there. Because respecting a bad law, for example, take for example apartheid South Africa. Apartheid was law. The fact that you have to separate blacks and whites. That was law. So then you come and say, no, I'm defending the rule of law. Yet you're defending a bad law.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yes. But isn't that a limitation for what is deemed legitimate by a particular group of people?
It's not only a limitation, but it's also a shortcoming.
Yeah.
Okay, because, and like I said, because when we elect people, for example, it is in the trust that they are going to pursue our interest.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in the end, what if they end up having narrow interests?
So would you say legitimacy at some point is primarily about the numbers, or who gets the majority vote? Yeah.
Maybe about the numbers, but its impact, its ultimate objective,
Yeah.
is to clothe some stimuli, some social strata with acceptability.
Yes.
Okay? Let me give you a very good example close to home.
Yeah.
You have a guy who was jailed. I won't even mention names because I don't want to seem political. A guy who's jailed. Okay? And that guy, what? Is sick.
Yeah.
Like, not, I'm not, his health is terrible. And I'm not talking about, a headache, like a muscle pain here, like proper. Okay? And then you say, but you see, because we respect the rule of law, okay, he has to be jailed.
Yeah.
Okay? No, let me not talk about them. Let me talk about South Africa, where I won't get in trouble. Jacob Zuma.
Yeah.
Jacob Zuma was jailed for, the initial sentence was 15 months
Yeah.
for failing to appear before a tribunal. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Why was he jailed? Because then the court held that the tribunal had the same stature as a court, and therefore him failing to appear was the deemed contempt of court.
Yeah.
Okay? And of course there's a law there, and okay. Then he's jailed for 15 months.
Yeah.
But the guy comes and says, look, I'm terribly ill, I'm unwell. I could die any minute. Number one. Two, this is a non-violent crime.
Yeah.
Even if you left me in my bedroom, okay, there will be no difference to your social strata.
Yeah.
But then you go like, oh no, the legitimate thing to do is to jail you because that's what the law says.
Yeah. And in that vein,
Yeah.
I've got a question for you.
Yes.
So, in your efforts to try to get to like a more conclusive reason why we do what we do, don't you think using legitimacy as the primary channel is somewhat limiting, because legitimacy in its nature is subjective?
Yeah, you see.
Don't you think it would have been better if you used a more like objective measure in line?
Like what?
Maybe our hedonistic nature as human beings, how we are wired evolutionarily or something like that. Because look, legitimacy, like based on the conversation we've had, it's somewhat fluid in nature, and it's almost mounted on social constructs.
Yeah, but it's legislated for. That's why it's legitimacy. There's a law that makes it acceptable, and this is really my argument.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go back to what people call illegitimate children, and I struggle to say that, by the way. Mm-hmm. The process of making a child is the same. A man and a woman will have sex.
Yeah.
Okay, and there'll be offspring there.
Yes.
From a scientific, physical point of view, that is done. Yeah. The reason you claim one child is legitimate and another one is not is because one has passed through the social construct of marriage, whereas the other one has not.
Okay.
So that in itself does not change the product.
Yeah.
Zero.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just because this one has been clothed, because legitimacy is, legislated for. There's a law. There's a Marriages Act.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, so not to be controversial.
Yes. Especially factoring in that today is Good Friday.
Good Friday. Jesus, let me ask you this question. Okay? The birth of Jesus, would you call it legitimate or illegitimate?
Personally, I think it's very illegitimate. Okay, so for example, the birth of Jesus doesn't fall necessarily into like a socially agreed upon marriage setup. Mm-hmm. First of all, Mary has this miraculous virgin birth, which doesn't make any sense scientifically. And then socially, that's why the Bible was like, that's why the narrative goes like, no, Mary had to be somewhat socially protected to some degree, because Joseph had to go there and tell people like, no. In fact, the angel had to first talk to Joseph, like, look, just take it easy. I know this is not necessarily what happens in normal circumstances, but she's going to give birth. Mm-hmm. And just raise the child like as if it was your own.
So what was the angel doing? The angel now was trying to clothe this
illegitimate practice into something legitimate. So Jesus was like a typical example of a child born out of wedlock. Or the wedlock was there, but out of another man's, like providence.
Not man.
Out of a spiritual providence.
And the point I'm trying to make is not to ridicule the birth story of Jesus.
Yes, but it doesn't.
It's just to show you that there's a lot of fluidity around this concept, and mostly it evolves as the opinion leaders, as the truth leaders, because not truth in inverted commas, as they evolve. Yeah. Okay. Today, and I can make this prediction extremely boldly. In 20 years' time, countries that do not accept gay rights will be in the minority. Yeah. Why? Because there's a wave that is moving, legitimizing that.
Yeah. It's almost an inevitability.
Yes, it's an inevitability, yeah.
But again, some people would argue that though Jesus' birth was kind of peculiar, that's what makes it a miracle, because it transcends the norm. So in a sense, the fact that there's admission that it transcends the norm, already that's legitimizing it in a sense. Like exactly. It's legitimate.
And maybe that speaks to how special Jesus was or is, and how special his mission, because it can't be ordinary. Yeah. But for you to gain acceptability, okay, there must be legitimacy. There are at least three occasions where you can see that, according to the Bible, Jesus is being clothed at least with that legitimacy. Yeah. During his baptism, there's a voice that comes from heaven and says, "That is my son in whom I'm well pleased."
Yeah, so already people are like mentally. And in fact, sorry to cut you short, there was already a social expectance for Jesus. People already knew that there has to be some sort of Messiah. And I read that book by Bart Ehrman called How Jesus Became God. Mm-hmm. So Bart Ehrman was basically trying to show whatever happened to Jesus, his miraculous birth, wasn't necessarily historically like a peculiarity. Mm-hmm. People already knew that this is what happens there. There's an emperor, sometimes not born of a man, but, spirit and stuff like that. So I I feel like Jesus falls into this culture that's already slightly accepting of his peculiar birth. And then there is also people waiting for this claimed Messiah to arrive and redeem them of their sins. So maybe that social acceptance already transcends this weirdness. No, his birth was what? So maybe already that's legitimizing.
Yeah, it could be that, but also you can see like there's an overt, very visible effort
Yes.
from God to ensure that Jesus gains that acceptability.
Yes.
First of all, that voice, and I think even on the what is called Mount of Transfiguration, when he was praying, and then his face changed, and there appeared Elijah. I don't know how they know it's Elijah, but there was Elijah. There was people that were already in heaven. Now that gives him that acceptability.
Yeah.
Now, and really, that's adding to my point to say, without legitimacy, then you are what is called a rebel.
What you're
Yeah, a rebel.
yeah.
Yeah. Coming back to governments, okay, especially in the 70s, 80s, even 60s in Africa, once countries became independent, a number of them had a rebel leader, one who was like, hey, I want to be president as well. I have to be president. And sometimes their mission and their cause was extremely laudable, but they were not the legitimate leader. So you had your people like Jonas Savimbi, Adam Mushala in Zambia, and so on. Yeah. Getting back even to the example in South Africa, the ANC, led by Nelson Mandela, was classified as what is it called? Along the lines of Al Qaeda and ISIS. Yeah, it was classified as a terrorist group. Yeah. Nelson Mandela himself was classified as a terrorist. There are countries that he couldn't visit. What changed between then and 1991 when he got out of jail, or 1994 when he became president, is that now he had been closed with legitimacy. Not that the man changed, no.
So, based on everything we've talked about, how do you drive a thread that links all these factors? Because at the end of the day, I feel like this is a very loaded concept you're trying to argue for, and it's easy to lose people. So, like, how do you drive a thread that just puts everything together into one canvas?
So my thesis is this: that truth is not truth up until it's legitimized. Okay? Truth is never truth until it's legitimized. The same way lies are not lies until they're legitimately lies.
Yes.
Now,
like the dystopia in George Orwell.
Yes.
Perfect example.
Oh, yes, that's a perfect example. 1984. Yeah. You can also read Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale. Yes.
Women were practically baby making machines. And it was, like these grim realities just kind of shows you how something that is made legitimate can really take off in very grotesque ways that leads humanity in like shameful outcomes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Paul in the Bible says, look, Lord, I was killing Jesus' disciples because I was passionate for your work. I believed I was legitimately doing your work. Yeah. Now, the point I'm trying to make in my book is legitimacy has nothing to do with right or wrong, but also may have everything to do with right or wrong. Having nothing to do with right or wrong is because just because something is legitimate doesn't make it right. Just because something is illegitimate doesn't make it wrong. I think we've discussed Jesus already. Yeah. And Leonardo da Vinci and so forth. Okay. So, racism. Yes, even racism, even apartheid and so on. So then we need to think long and hard before we legitimize. Because currently the way you legitimize is by enacting it into law. Yeah.
And I feel like it would also equally be interesting if you, after you've laid out all these limitations of legitimacy, its loopholes and all that stuff, it would be nice if you build up a robust argument that actually transcends legitimacy. to a point where you go like, what sort of like judging criteria as well as approach can we take maybe towards like an agreed upon truth? But at the end of the day, again, it's almost the same thing because it has to be socially agreed upon, you know. And we're the biggest flaw is that us being humans, we are social animals. So you might argue, you might die on the hill of a truth that you have personally deemed an objective truth.
Yes.
When in actuality, there's no people that are seeing your point. So
Exactly.
it's more like you're punching in the air.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So how?
And that's the frustration I'm trying to bring out.
Yeah.
To think that, 600 years ago, women were classified as an extension of a man's possession. In some countries, even to this day, some women, the sectors of women are not allowed to drive.
Yes.
In some countries, if you are not married, you cannot show your face as a woman. The Bible itself says women cannot speak in church unless, and they only have to speak through their husbands.
If they have a question, they have to go and ask. They have to
home.
ask at home.
Not here.
Ask your husband at home.
Yes. So I kind of feel like in our collective conscious, there are things we get like, wait a minute. This may not actually be good for us.
Yeah.
Because we are wired with all these evolutionary things that have moved us from point A to point B. And that is why you see there's a movement towards women's rights and so on. Okay? Not what the Bible says, no, but tells us, women, that kind of thing. Yeah. So I think if there's any theory that is above legitimacy, that transcends sectarian interests and so forth, it could be that, I don't know what it would be called, but it could be that innate desire deeply placed in each one of us that goes above religion, that goes above practice and so forth, and that says, this is the direction that we're heading. And hopefully we can all tap into that. Yeah. But say, for example, a deeply religious and Islamic country like Saudi Arabia, after years and years and years, finally saying, okay, you know what? Maybe women can actually drive. Yeah? That's a huge win for them. But also it shows that there's some currency here. Saudi Arabia, after years and years, allowed WWE performers to stage a show in Riyadh. Okay, they called it the King of the Ring. That deal actually signed between the monarch there and the WWE. And WWE were paid millions of dollars to bring their superstars there. Of course, they said, okay, the women can kind of wear, head cover and so forth. But just the fact that you can bring in that and have men perform in their underwear and so on, that itself should tell that deep down all of us, in spite of all the noise around what we've been conditioned to believe, there is some evolutionary force that pushes us towards where our race will be better.
I think before we close, I would like to play the devil's advocate for a bit. So you said you're trying to you'd like, maybe you would desire to perhaps express a point that argues for something right in a way that taps into our most base human psychology, what we know deep down as that sense of doing an upright action. But then a religious person can stand against your argument with some level of like superiority and say, look, as we have an inspired piece of text, it's the Bible, and in this inspired piece of text, it's inspired by a God who obviously transcends human actions, human intuitions, and he has given us these sets of laws, values, morals that guide us and that are objective because they go beyond our base. That's their argument, that they go beyond base human intuitions, and these are objective and objectively binding on every human being. So in a sense, as we're not held captive by these little provincial subsets of legitimacy, ours is like a higher legitimacy that transcends everything. So, in a sense, we beat you at the game of like what makes us obey, because us at the end of the day, it's God who tells us to do these things, and there's a uniformity that you guys don't have because your legitimacy is somewhat it's got subcategories.
The
Like
silos, yeah.
if you go to the European countries, they are more given to these types of sets of ideas. If you go this side, they're given to these types of sets of ideas. But us, we're unified in a sense. And this is what we have. What can you say against that?
Well, I don't think that argument holds in light of the text that it can, if at all, it has to be derived from that text. It doesn't hold at all. Because, well, and by the way, where I am, and I'm sorry if this thing, but I don't like having the them versus us conversations. Because I believe we are all trapped in this, what I call the human predicament. We're trying to understand who are we, why are we here, and that kind of thing. So I think it's a cop out. It's lending your reason, okay, to the whims and wishes, okay, of a text that is extremely ambiguous and also contradictory. Yeah, that's what I would say.
And it was, and if you want to borrow like a set of morals from like these biblical narratives, there's also stories that just make you drop your jaw.
Let's examine one.
Yes.
It says if you rape a girl, and she's not married, and she's a virgin,
Just marry her.
you have the option of marrying her, or going to the parents of the girl with a turtle dove, okay, as evidence of your being remorseful. I'm sorry. No. And that's serious because you've seen the cases that are going around, people defiling kids and so forth. Yeah. Now, what has happened to that legitimacy? Because I don't think anyone can stand for that.
Yeah, it's been beaten out and down through human experience and as well as human progress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Exactly. So, well, and I don't care whether it's a turtle dove or 20 pieces of silver or kettle and so forth.
That doesn't take away the fact that
No, it doesn't.
what you did was morally grotesque.
Exactly. So then it introduces the second layer of questioning. What really drives our moral compass? It certainly can't be a religious text. Because if it were a religious text, even to this day, once we read that story, this man defiled, then there will be no. But then he took some turtle doves and he's married there. And that's the end of it. So society in itself has a psyche. And that's what I believe. And while the religious texts can provide certain pointers, but there are certain good things in the Bible, by the way. Yeah. Some certain things that even to this day I hold on to. Okay. Things like do unto others like you would want them to do unto you. That's a beautiful code to live by. Okay. But you've seen that the way society has been layered, even just with the law, you're like, okay, you know what? We need to protect property rights. Jesus asked this question. Jesus, there's a woman who was married. The first husband died, the second died, and the third one died. Whose wife is she going to be at the resurrection? Doesn't matter what the woman feels like or thinks. Okay, whose wife?
So it even shows you the mindset these guys were open.
That's the thing. But today, would you stand for that?
Absolutely.
Even in this Christian camp, by the way, that is a Christian camp because it's in the Constitution.
Yeah, absolutely not.
And so I'm trying to show you that the fleeting types of legitimacy and the fact that ultimately, despite us having a holy text and so forth, and those that say no, we answer to a higher power, I doubt any of them would do what that higher power commands them to do through the holy text.
Yeah, true. Yeah. That's why it even kind of reminds me of the youthful dilemma. Is something wrong because God says it's wrong, or is it wrong because it's wrong?
Yeah, actually Jay-Z raps about that.
Oh, for real?
It's pious.
Yeah.
But pious is pious.
Or is this pious because it's pious?
Yes.
I feel like this conversation could drag on and on and on, but for this first set, I think we should end here.
Thanks.
So if we had to put timelines, when do you see your... Since now people are like, we've propped people's minds. They want to see the richness of your argument. What we're basically doing is just touching the fringes. So,
but the way I write, dude, I'm meticulous. Yeah. So I expect, because I'm going to have a launch in December, so the text will be done by June. So I'm in a very prolific vein. So I'm doing 2 books at a go. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a tough one. And rest assured, we shall be there to film that thing, that occasion, that grandiose occasion. Because already we've started this, so we definitely want you guys to see through it and get that book when it's out. I don't know if you have any last words to just close
Thanks for this platform, and I know this keeps growing. Surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, you are not nominated for this. Is that your social media awards? Because
people don't love science.
No, they don't. They don't love philosophy.
They don't love philosophy.
Yeah. But look, let's interact. One day I would want you to bring me here with someone with opposing views and. Yeah.
I think the arguments that we've raised are already controversial in nature, and people are already ticking to argue with it. So definitely,
and I know everyone's going to pick up. No, he said Jesus was a legit. No. Oh, man.
So definitely, I'll bring you a formidable opponent.
Okay.
And it won't be shoddy stuff like, hey, you mentioned Jesus and the Bible. No.
Yeah.
This one's gonna make sure you have a good time and a good conversation.
Let's do this.
All right. Until next time.